Hello, and welcome to Vision New England's Church in Action podcast. Here we talk with New England leaders about critical issues that impact how Christians engage in our culture to accelerate evangelism.
Hi, I'm Charles Galda. I'm the president of Vision New England. Welcome to the Church in Action podcast. Thanks for being with us today. We've been having a dialogue around a specific issue of mental health called trauma, and we'll share a little bit more about that. But really want to step back for a second, just share, if you've not heard one of our podcasts before, a big focus of our podcast is biblical justice. The Bible talks about justice as anything that hinders someone's ability to participate in the fullness of life that God intends for them here on earth. And there's a lot of things that would fall into that bucket. And so we have the imperative in Micah to do justice. And that's why so many believers and why Vision New England has a focus on issues like human trafficking, adoption and foster care, prison reentry, addiction ministries, racial reconciliation, feeding the hungry, housing the homeless. And Jesus told us in Matthew 5:16, what happens when his people do this? The world sees it and they will praise God. So there's an evangelistic impact of us answering God's call to do justice in our communities. And so we've really been focusing lately on mental health and trauma in particular. If you heard one of our podcasts in December, we had Dr. Karen Mason from Gordon Conwell on, and she's a clinician, a psychologist, as well as a professor, and she shared a definition of trauma that I found helpful. It's a person who is exposed to a sudden catastrophic event that exposed them to actual or threatened death, injury, or violence, coupled with some kind of emotional response that's more than normal stress. And so we're going to test that definition with our guest today. But that idea is something that is prevalent in our country today in a lot of different places. We hear it a lot in the racial conversation. I think we're starting to hear it in the COVID conversation. I think that will come up today. But wanted to come at it from a slightly different perspective today. We want to talk about it from the vantage point of church ministry. And so we've got two really special guests with us today. I say really special because I used to attend their church when we lived in Connecticut. But Walnut Hill Community Church, for those of you who don't know, is a large multi-campus church in southwestern Connecticut, based in Bethel. And we've got our first guest is Pastor Adam DePasquale. He's one of the lead pastors at Walnut Hill, and Lucy Houghton, who's Walnut Hill's director of care ministry. And a clinical social worker and has experience in trauma. And so Lucy and Adam, thanks so much for being with us today.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having us, Charles.
Yeah, thank you, Charles.
Thanks. And Adam, maybe a few questions just to start out with you to kind of set the landscape a little bit. Could you just give us a sketch for folks who may not know Walnut Hill? Could you just give us a sketch of, so who is Walnut Hill?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Amazingly, in just about 1 month, we're going to turn 39 years old, which I laugh because in terms of New England church, that's a baby, right? But God has done some great things in here over the years. As you mentioned, we're a multi-campus church. We have 4 physical locations here in southwestern Connecticut, as you mentioned, and then an online campus, which is doing really well, and we're thankful for that. I'd say that the heartbeat of Walnut Hill is to ignite a passion for Jesus in people's lives. So we put a lot of emphasis on prayer, on worship, on sharing Jesus with others, as we'll talk about today, about caring for others, being the hands and feet of Jesus, in our everyday lives and our community around the world. So our focus is really the hope found in a relationship with Jesus.
And so how does that connect us to a conversation about trauma? How did Walnut Hill get into this space? How did you get into this space?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. It's difficult to speak about, even still, but it was 8 years ago that our community really became known around the world overnight due to a horrific tragedy in Sandy Hook, Newtown, which is just a few miles from the church. You might remember it was like a sick young man. He killed his mother, and then he drove to the local elementary school where he murdered, it was 20 first graders and 6 educators before taking his own life. So, the evil and grief that was thrust upon our community was unbelievable and, unimaginable. So as a church, our largest campus is located right nearby, as I mentioned, and we have hundreds of congregants that live in Newtown, including myself. And at the time, our former senior pastor lived in Newtown. And so we became immediately involved. I remember it was just minutes after the shooting had taken place, and there was still a lot of confusion around what was actually happening. But one of our congregants called our senior pastor and said, "I could really use your support. I'm down here waiting for my child." And so our senior pastor went down, and we got involved in that right away. And so, our involvement in that recovery process still continues today, 8 years later.
And so what did Walnut Hill, how did Walnut Hill help in that? And what did you guys learn?
Yeah. Before I answer that, as part of that, I would say, I want to start by saying how proud I am of the Newtown community. When I look back now and I consider the enormous grief and the pressure that our local leaders were going through at that time, and I consider how well they led, I'm just really blown away, and I'm very thankful. And I say that to share that one of the first things that the town did was they had a professional community assessment done of the town. And out of that came a report by a woman named Dr. Jill Barron. And I'd love to just read you a few points that she wrote. And it has to do with, what are we learning from trauma? And so there's 4 points. The first one was, in the wake of a tragedy such as this, each and every member of the community is impacted. I just want to pause there because you might think to yourself, is that really true that every person in a community will be impacted? And we can honestly say that that's the case. I had a picture early on of a gigantic boulder coming down from the sky and landing in the middle of a very small pond. And where that boulder hit were those families who went through that incredible loss. And then the ripple effect from that just traumatic hit went across the pond. And we found that to be true. I mean, if you think about survivors in the school, other children, other parents, families, if you think about other teachers and first responders, if you think about sports coaches who all of a sudden had kids missing on their team, or piano teachers, and you could go all the way down to even business owners in town. After that tragedy took place, very few people wanted to come to Newtown to eat or to shop. And so even business owners were impacted. And that statement that everyone is impacted is absolutely true. The second thing she said is how impacted an individual or group is not always directly related to the proximity to the tragedy. And that can be explained by her third point. The relative strengths, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities of an individual, group, or community prior to a tragedy play an important role in how impacted they might be by a traumatic event. So one way to understand that was, we found that if someone had experienced loss in their life prior to the Sandy Hook tragedy, the tragedy just raised that grief and that pain right back up to the surface as if it had happened the day before. So we bring our life experiences and hurts continually forward each day, and we found that to be true. Number four, she said, every community member will be in a different place at a different time with regards to how they process their understanding and response to an event. And I think initially our thought was, wow, let's unify together and move forward together and heal together. And I think what you find in trauma is that that's not what happens, that everyone has their own journey of healing and own journey of processing and learning and recovery, which means that we need to be very compassionate and sensitive to everyone, wherever they are in that space. So I think those are definitely 4 learnings that we saw from Newtown.
And so I want to make sure I understand a couple of those. So the last one I take to mean that you and I might be just as connected to the event, but you might be in a position within a month to actually go to counseling or go through some healing or be able to talk about it even, it might take me 6 months.
Or years.
And so we can't there's not a vanilla cookie cutter process of bringing people through something that's been traumatic. It's a customized thing.
And we make that mistake thinking that we can all move together. And we make the mistake of thinking, oh, that person wasn't as impacted. Why can't they just get on with it? And that's not how it works.
Well, and I want to talk about that for a second too, if we can. So the notion that you might be closer to what actually happened than I was because of other events in my life or other experiences or other support infrastructure, I may experience more trauma than you.
Yeah, and I would say
vice versa.
Yes, and I would say not taking into account those who were directly impacted, because we can never imagine the pain and suffering they're going through. But when we get to the outer rings, that's absolutely true.
Okay. And so what do we say to folks, and Lucy, I don't want to exclude you from any of this. So just jump in anytime. What do we say to the folks who would say, well, come on, I was just as close as it to you. And I'm fine. I've gotten past it. It was sad. It was tragic, but I've gotten past it. Come on, stiff upper lip, keep going. What do we say to that kind of thought?
What I've experienced through working alongside families is that it was the relational closeness. So those that were connected to families, they, although were not necessarily even living in the area, they were friends. It impacted them hugely, and it's taken a longer time to move on. But we all fundamentally will heal at our own pace. And so what works for one person is not going to work for another. There are definitely methodologies, there are definitely therapies that will work for every single person, but the timing and how long we go through that process is individual. For some, it will take years and years as they work through the layers of trauma that they experience. I think of those who, we forget about the funeral directors, those that put all of the remembrance things throughout Sandy Hook and Newtown, and every time they were faced with the names of the children and they were reminded of the suffering that went on.
And so Lucy, how would you, maybe kind of building on that same thought, so stiff upper lip and all that is, I hear what you're saying. What about the thought of, hey, it's not good to dwell on this stuff. It's better to just put it behind us and move on. Is that true for some people and not others, or is that never true?
I think it's a balanced approach. I think it's about, are we getting stuck? Are we getting, we're talking here about grief. Are we getting stuck in a certain place of grief, and do we need help to move on to a next step, to be able to move forward with it, to heal? Or is that person just going to continue and put it behind them, but they might find in 10 years time in another situation, another trauma, a loss, all of a sudden things that took place will be triggered. That stuff doesn't just disappear, it sits within us, and at whatever stage we choose to deal with that, it's going to come out.
It's interesting. You're reminding me when I was a young kid, so maybe 3 or 4, I had a cousin who was my age, and she died at 3 or 4 years old. And I remember being with my uncle, her father, 30 plus years later, when now one of my cousins, so same age, one of their children died of cancer. And my uncle was crying at the funeral. And I remember talking to him, and he's like, I thought I was past it. It's like it happened yesterday. And so that's what you're talking about there, is that it comes back even though we think we're well beyond it.
Yeah. Our bodies hold memories.
Yeah. And so so we're 8 years past it, or behind us. I shouldn't say past it, but it's 8 years behind us. Is the community beyond the trauma at this point? Or can you not even look at it that way because it's so individualized?
Adam, what's your thoughts?
I would say
And
this,
if that's a dumb question, Adam, you
No,
know me
no,
well
no.
enough to say it's a dumb question.
I would say this. I've been so. I'm going to speak personally now, it's it's a father who lives in Newtown whose children were in a different school who survived, right? And I say that I have been so thankful that my children have been raised in Newtown, because the compassion and the kindness and the teaching that has been intentionally done in our school systems has been remarkable. And so my kids have grown up in this ultra intentional environment to be caring and to stop bullying and to create warmth. And so I think because of all that intentionality, we're emerging as a really special city to live in, a special town. And so in that regards, there's some really beautiful things that have come out of something really horrific. With that being said, there are triggers every year for the community. And of course, those who lost loved ones live with it every day, right? So I think you're right to talk about it in terms of a journey and a multi-year journey.
And it was interesting that some of those things that, because there's always the commemorative things that are happening each year, and well after the first year, where I think some people felt that was helpful, was what we would hear. And then there were some people who, I can't see this, right? And moved. Yeah, because it was hurt. It would bring all the pain back again. Is that a little bit about going at we're just wired up differently, or we've got different infrastructure and experiences, or is that some combination?
I think it's a combination, but I think some people felt that they needed to start again. They needed to move away. They needed to be able to remove themselves. Because the one thing we haven't mentioned, I mean, Adam referred to it when we first started, was overnight, Sandy Hook was across the headlines of every single country in the world. That there wasn't one country who was not aware of something taking place in Sandy Hook. And this is a small town, a small community attached to Newtown, and you have the eyes of the press on that town, on every person. And I think for some, it was a case of, we need to remove ourselves, we need to keep ourselves safe. And a way of doing that is physically, moving.
Yeah. And there was, I remember there's also a lot of people wanting to help, some actually helping, some doing damage, trying to help. How do we avoid that, right? So if I'm on whether it's Sandy Hook or something else, I see that there's been pain and suffering, and I want to help. How do I know if I'm helping me or if I'm actually helping that person?
I know for Newtown, what was important for people to ask, and I think so often we don't ask, and that could be in any area of trauma. We just assume that what we think is the best thing for someone is the right thing. But if you actually stop and say, hey, would this be a help to you? All of a sudden you find that either it was, or that something different would be, and it's something that you have to offer as well. So I think you have to be sensitive to other people before your own needs. Yeah.
And the thing that I picked up in some of that conversation was, I don't know that I thought logically about it, but just the thought process would have been, I'm either helping you or I'm not helping you. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until we got into some of those conversations was, no, there's a third option. You can be doing further damage.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. And so how does it look like over the 8 years? Have folks who, I don't know the right way to even phrase the question, but how has it played out over time? Maybe is a better way to say it. Both maybe at a macro and a micro level for folks. What have you seen?
And just to look at this from a micro level, I don't know, Adam, if you want to speak to the macro in a minute, but I think the impact has been the longevity of recovery. This is something, as we've just said, will take years. And so the impact on relationships, marriages, the impact on mental health, which is what we're here really focusing on today, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, We've experienced suicides in the community, which is just such a tragic loss when you've already walked through a loss. Very understandable. It felt like at the time that there was no book to enable people to follow. This is how we recover. This is how we do well. And so everybody is finding their own way, getting support through counseling and groups. But at the end of the day, that person is still doing their own journey. And if there were any signs or previous experiences of mental illness, it was a period of time when things were exacerbated. So I think we're seeing that still playing out on many people's lives. Others have managed to work through that and have some incredible strategies that they use. So it's not all negative. People have been really effective in managing depression and coping with what's taken place. But the sadness is that we see marriages falling apart as well. There's been that ongoing impact. How people deal with grief even within a marriage is very different. How do you cope with anger? How do you communicate? The guilt, I can't imagine what the guilt must feel like that one wasn't able to protect or do what they wanted to do for their child. So there's many factors that play in at the moment. Adam, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting. You and I were speaking earlier, I think last week, and you brought up that, in a post-tragedy, you almost lose the ability to dream and to hope and to create and to innovate. And it's like you're just zapped of energy. And so I remember probably one of the greatest moments, there have been many, but was when they reopened the Sandy Hook Elementary School, and they had hired a really creative architect, and they worked long and hard. I mean, it was a community project with lots of input and lots of feedback. But what came out of that was one of the most amazing elementary schools you could ever see. It incorporates, rain coming on the roof into waterfalls, and it's beautiful, right? And so in one sense, when creativity started to emerge again in the town, it was an indication that something really beautiful was starting to happen. The other thing I think we talked about was that there has been a journey of people struggling with the theological concept that God is good. And I think we heard right from the beginning, how could a God who's good allow this to happen? And you do your best to answer that pastorally, but sometimes that just takes years to begin to walk through and experience. And so I think that's, Charles, an ongoing question: is God really good? And how do we reconcile that, if that makes sense?
And I imagine there's different flavors of that based on where you are too, right? I may be a believer who I intellectually get that, and it's ingrained in me, and I get that God is good despite that, and I understand all the reasons. I also could imagine, but tell me if I'm thinking about it right, that I also may be a believer who I intellectually know that, but now as it's playing out, it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah.
And I think I might also be an unbeliever, and I don't get that at all.
And I don't know that we are able to articulate that clearly right away. It begins as this undergirding discomfort in our heart and our spirit and our soul. And eventually it comes out probably in a moment we least expect, where we're like, I just don't think God's good, or I don't believe in God anymore, or where was he? So I think those are important topics for pastors to be sensitive to.
And so what I think I'm hearing you say, Adam, is that we may know the responses to that. It may not be helpful to give the responses to it at certain times. Is that?
Certainly, Christianese quick answers is not the right answer, but there are ways to talk about it in I think meaningful ways.
And so what's come out of this in terms of what Walnut Hill does then? Are there formal ministries you guys have? Is it informal that it's been ingrained in other parts of what the church ministry is, and how does that look maybe inside the church and in the community?
Charles, I would say this, Charles. I think we were a caring church prior, to that, but we are now a compassionate church in a way that we could never have been otherwise. I remember shortly after the tragedy took place, it was probably within hours, our former senior pastor, Clive Calver, who you know well, he used to work for World Relief, which, obviously is a large relief organization. He brought us together and he said, everything has changed. Our community needs us. Let's get ministering. And then he gave us 4 kind of directives. I don't know if he said it exactly like this, but he said, mobilize prayer, care for people, gather resources, and then connect with local leaders and officials. There were pretty clearly 4 things. And so we really worked hard to mobilize prayer, and prayer has been a foundational ministry to Walnut Hill, but certainly it is all the more so in terms of even how we care for others through prayer. You talked about care. Lots of ministries began out of Sandy Hook, and we actually, World Relief also helped us do an assessment of Walnut Hill and where we were weak and strong. So today we have grief programs and recovery programs and marriage support programs, cancer support, parenting and marriage support. Some of these were existing prior, but all of them went to an entirely new level on the other side of that. And I think that was really important. We still have a very small amount of money left in a fund that is designated to Sandy Hook support. And so I think resources were really important at that time so that we were able to help community members with counseling, with practical needs that those who were impacted by. So I think churches need resources to work in the area of trauma. And then I would just say this to you. I think one of the things we do least well as church is collaborate and partner. In other words, we love to come out with a program that we think is going to fix the problems of society. But when you think about something like Sandy Hook or other traumas, it's a situation that took place in a city. And so right off the bat, you have local leaders and state leaders and national leaders who have a responsibility for that situation. You have all sorts of nonprofits. There were over 40 nonprofits that quickly grew out of the Sandy Hook time period, all with specialized missions to help in some way. And then in addition to that, you have businesses that are putting tremendous amount of their corporate dollars into trying to help as well. And so often as church, we like to just think it's our job to do X. And I think something we learned through this season was, no, if we're going to be effective, we have to work together. And we learned so many lessons through that. And we had so many opportunities to partner together to come about a solution that would be longer lasting and more effective. And that still continues today at Walnut Hill. It became a new DNA for us, I think.
One thing I've observed, both in the Walnut Hill experience and here, is a lot of times we evangelicals will feel that government is against us, and government does not support the church and does not like the church. And there's some reasons why that's a perception. What I found in the Sandy Hook example and a lot of others is when we collaborate the way you're saying, and then stick to our swim lanes, they love us. And so what I mean by that is I recognize I can't do that, right? We, like in our work with human trafficking, right? The Department of Homeland Security and the FBI love working with the ministries we have in New England to do that, because none of them are trying to go raid brothels and attack pimps and all of those kinds of things. They're doing things a church can do, which is love and help survivors recover. And they love us, and we get all kinds of support from government when that happens. And I think that was true at the Sandy Hook level too, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, in reality, the pastors were asked to come down and blessed to come and be with families. I mean, I remember, as an example of what you're talking about, going down into Sandy Hook on the day this took place with so many news trucks and cameras and rifles and military. And once we identified ourselves as pastors, being ushered through all of that right to the place where people were, because like you're saying, they understood that ministers have experience caring for people. And in moments like that, almost every person, you know, what's the old statement that when you're on the battlefield, there's no atheist or whatever it might be. I think in moments of crisis, we all recognize that we need help outside of ourselves. So I think you're absolutely right.
I remember you bringing in Philip Yancey, who's been involved in a number of similar situations, talking about some of these issues. Did it impact kind of the sermons, the tone of what was being communicated? Did all that stuff change? I guess maybe a better question, did anything, because I see you nodding, did anything not change?
Yeah. Probably nothing didn't change, right? Except for what we're talking about, that the role of the church is to provide the hope that comes through a relationship with Jesus Christ. And when you talk about our lanes, that's our lane. So we preached a lot about healing and hope and a God who's unchanging and who's faithful, and tried to create a more transparent and vulnerable environment for people to feel safe to share. And so there was a strong message on come to the Jesus who loves you, you know, come to the Jesus who can help you. So yeah, that was part of that.
And I lost track of something, but it just came back to me. I want to go back to something that Lucy had mentioned before, where it talked about the marital difficulties of folks going through the grief and trauma at different rates. And so if folks are interested in seeing how that plays out, there's a book called Hit Hard by Pat and Tammy McLeod. Pat and Tammy are a couple who work for Cru at Harvard, and Tammy is also on staff at Park Street. And through a family incident, they went through something that the technical term I understand is ambiguous loss, and how they went through the grieving of that ambiguous loss differently, and how it played out in their marriage. And at the end of the story, the good news at the end of the story, by figuring it out and getting the right kind of help to figure it out, their marriage is whole. But it was a real challenge when one person is saying, well, why don't you feel this way? And the other person is not, right? And doesn't understand why you feel the way you do. And so Hit Hard is the name of that book. And so help us bring this to today. So we understand Sandy Hook was traumatic in the way that I assume for a lot of people, 9/11 would have brought those same kind of things on. Katrina brought those same things on. And then there's more personal, smaller items that only my family experienced this potentially, or a small group of us experienced something like this. So it goes from these, I guess, mega events to very personal events. But we're all going through COVID now. Is there a relationship between trauma as we've been talking about it and things we're seeing or going to see related to COVID?
And I think the trauma impacts the same way, no matter what the circumstance. I think one of the differences at the moment is that we're all experiencing it. This is global. It's impacting us. We know we all have friends who've experienced COVID, families who have lost loved ones. So there's grief. There is the fact that we're having to deal with a situation where we're not in control. We cannot control what is going to happen. We don't know what might happen tomorrow. And that then creates a level of anxiety. And I believe that most of us are living in some level of anxiety about this at different periods or different times over the last, where are we, 11 months now, I think it could be. You know, if we spoke this time last year and actually thought about the fact that we may not be able to leave our homes because a virus could potentially cause significant damage to our well-being physically, we'd have laughed. But the truth is that's what we've gone through from March through to May. In the Northeast, for sure, we were in a lockdown. In other parts of the world, it continued for a much longer period of time. And so I think the trauma and what I've really seeing and probably, you know, I know experience myself, is the isolation. We've now got used to a lifestyle of Zoom, of speaking through cameras. I'm very fortunate. I have a household and there's 5 of us. But how does that feel for a household of 1? That you may not have physical touch, I remember someone saying to me, I haven't had a hug in such a long time, because they live on their own and they knew that they couldn't. The impact of not being able to smile at one another face to face, to be able to touch one another. So it's hitting us at a level that we're all relating to. And one of the differences, some people just couldn't relate to the level of trauma that took place in Sandy Hook, understandably. So it's similar, but it's also very different.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Adam.
Well, I was just going to say that I think you see with trauma that trauma brings about, it's a spiritual, it's an emotional, it's a physical impact, and that's consistent no matter what the trauma is. And so I think by definition there, it means that it's going to take years of recovery and whatever the trauma is, and not the weeks and months that maybe we often hope for. And I think that's true of COVID as well.
Yeah.
One of the things I've noticed is just a lot of stories about people, especially church people, taking it out on their pastors, it seems, where they're just going after their pastor on things. And so I hear consistently stories about people who, and as usual, we point to one thing, and that thing may or may not actually be the thing we point to that we're mad about, right? And so you, pastor, talked about masks. And I've been here for 20 years. We've been together. We're friends. I'm not coming back. Pastor, you didn't talk about masks. I'm not coming back. You talked about race. I'm not coming back. You didn't talk about race. I'm not coming. And one pastor who had a guy jump all over him because he didn't wear a tie one Sunday. And are those things the outworking of people's trauma? I guess if that's not normal behavior for them already.
But it's interesting you say that, because that is a good point. I do think that what happens with trauma, it seems, is that there are some who are naturally, their personalities are natural to want to create action and do something and to bring about a result, and others who are very much more wanting to be caring and calm and patient. And that brings up, I think it raises political issues, but it doesn't even have to be political from a government standpoint, but it brings up conflict. Why are you moving so quickly? With Sandy Hook, the issues of gun control came up as right away, because that comes from a real heart. How do we stop this from happening so others never experience this again? And I think that's a natural part of trauma. But we recognize it if it comes from a heart that everyone is trying to do what they can do. Everyone is hurting. And most often all these responses are coming from the same place. We can find unity in that core grief area.
So if you look back on how it's kind of evolved over time, and the church's role in it, I don't think Walnut Hill had a plan about how we're going to engage into trauma ministry. I think you learned as you went. Is that fair? And so if I'm a church, though, big or small, and capabilities will be different and resources will be different, but if I'm a church and I'm hearing this and I'm recognizing that actually maybe there's trauma I already need to be dealing with and nothing to do with COVID, and now I'm realizing or seeing some of that. Or, okay, I get it. COVID's created it already and we're going to see more of it. What do I do? How do I get started?
Go ahead, Lucy. Yeah.
So you're talking in terms of ministry that could be created within churches. It's incredible how many resources there are that are already set up. And so if you look at some of the main impacts that we've seen is loss. So being able to bring in a grief program, whether it's something like grief recovery or grief share into the church, you've got resources that you can use. And people may deal with a loss of a loved one due to COVID, but they might also want to come to a group because they experienced loss a couple of years ago and feel that they got stuck and would like that support. We've also got a similar setup for divorce care. And again, You've got families who are living under one roof. They're experiencing economic stress. You've got parents who are now teachers who never thought they would be. And you've got just the pressure of being in the home. So the impact on relationships. So I think the need to focus on supporting marriages and running a marriage class so that hopefully it doesn't have to get to the point of needing divorce care. But there's, there are the resources there that you can use. And I think anything that can bring people into a safe place where they can communicate how they feel, where they can begin to actually kind of unpeel some of those layers of the trauma and actually talk about what is going on for them and be able to understand that it's not just them. Trauma puts you into a place of isolation and builds walls around you. And then to be able to be in a place to recognize, oh, this person also feels like this. Perhaps I'm not crazy. It's very validating. So there are various groups that can take place. There's a lot of training available. One of the things more recently this year we began was a mental health support group we piloted for the first time and actually chose to do that for caregivers. So predominantly that was parents who were supporting teens and young adults in their family because of the stress on them as being the carers, always trying to do the right thing, trying to understand and make sense of mental health. We started this just before COVID lockdown kicked in, and what was just going to be an 8-week group turned into 14 weeks of Zoom. And parents, again, listening to other parents, their experiences, encouraging one another, bringing scripture into that, prayer into that, but also an education around what is mental health, what is this illness, what's the impact of that. But the overall feeling I have and just my experience is that if you enable people to begin to communicate with one another and have a safe space to express that, you build unity, you build trust, and then people can begin to heal.
I think there's a sense. Oops, sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, no, I was just going to say, I think what comes to my mind too is that every church has a role to play, and I think sometimes we think we're too small or we're too big, whatever it might be. But in the case of Sandy Hook, there was a lovely church called Faith at Newtown right down in the middle of Sandy Hook. It might have only been 24 people in that church. And the ministry that they had because of their location was just incredible. And so I think part of what I'm just trying to say is I would just encourage that every church has a role to play in this COVID pandemic. And if you start with prayer, and if you start by asking the Lord, how can you use me, Lord? What is it you're calling us to do? If a church reaches out to its community and says, how can we be of help? I think you're going to find a God-sized calling upon your community that will make you tremble and bring you to your knees. And you might say, we don't have enough resources, the Lord. And that's where the Lord says, I own all the cattle on the hills, right? And so I would just encourage any church to really allow God to be big through them.
And I'm so glad you said that about prayer, because I was formulating my next question too, and it was going around. So what's my job when the person is talking to me, Lucy, like you were just talking about there, and that sharing of it is helpful. What's my job in that? Is it more like when I'm at the hospital, as we would counsel back then, sometimes your job is just sit there and be quiet and not say anything. But sometimes it's not. And how do I know is, well, I should be praying about it. Right? In the moment, even, I may need to be praying about it because you may not have known it was coming.
Yeah. I think Adam spoke to this earlier. It's asking the questions. Asking the person, what do you need? What would be helpful? Our groups have really come from what people have said they needed as a response to that. And in actual fact, the most valuable thing we can do is be listeners. We can all do that. And I think we forget just how important that one-to-one listening, giving people the opportunity to share their story, what they've experienced, is really powerful. And then being able to pray for them, that contact once a week. every couple of weeks. Just being that friendly face, somebody they can text and say, can you pray for me in this moment? And then if you get a sense of several people coming to you saying that they have this need, is that the question of, okay, how do we address it?
And so how do I spot it for myself? How do I know that when I get mad at Adam for some, in the grand scheme of things, it's a silly issue, how do I know I'm not really mad at Adam? How do I know I've actually got a different issue to be dealing with?
Sometimes it's very difficult because it gets all confused. But there's a couple of things that I've really learned to do, and that is to ask some simple questions. How am I feeling today in this moment? If we can begin to recognize how we feel, then we will understand better why we're responding in a certain way. Today, am I feeling really angry that COVID isn't gone? Am I feeling angry that the kids aren't in school? Am I feeling angry about another circumstance? Or am I in fear? Am I fearful about my job? Is it possible, am I going to lose my job tomorrow? Perhaps I won't be able to pay the mortgage, or actually I haven't got food in the cupboards to feed the children. And so asking some very simple questions. How do I feel? What is happening in my body in this precise moment? Is my heart racing? Am I feeling hot or cold? Do I feel like I just want to, does my body just wanting to run away? So there's very simple questions we can ask ourselves to begin to regulate what is going on in our body, to understand our responses. Because when we begin to do that, instead of you wanting, for your example, to be mad with Adam over something, you might fit in a pause before you open your mouth, because you'll have a check in your mind that says, how am I feeling? Where is that coming from and why? Now, I'm not saying that we do this all the time, but if we practice it, it's amazing how it does begin to become a really healthy habit.
So what I hear you saying is, once I determine it's not trauma, I'm allowed to yell at Adam. Is that what I just said?
Yeah, Charles, I was just thinking that, we all have coping mechanisms that we employ when we're under stress. And I think, kind of going along with Lucy saying, is we can keep an eye on that, and we can ask our close friends about that. So, for instance, I gained some weight during the middle of COVID, and I think maybe a bunch of us did. The other thing is, for me, I start cleaning a little too much, and Carrie, my wife, can tell you that, all of a sudden it's like, okay, leave it alone already, but we all have those things that we start to do, and actually some of them become more destructive, right? Wow, all of a sudden we're drinking more than we used to. All of a sudden, like you mentioned, we're yelling more. And I think if we're honest with ourselves about those indicators, and we have people who are honest with us about those things, sometimes the closest to us, maybe we'll catch things. The other thing I would just mention is that actually out of the Sandy Hook time period, I discovered this thing called the emotional wheel. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but you can look it up on Google, right? Emotional wheel. And there are these wheels that have 100 different emotions listed on them. And it helps you identify what you're feeling in any moment. And so for those of us who have a hard time putting words, all of a sudden you move from angry to disappointed and all of a sudden you go, wow, I never could put this word to this before. That's been really helpful for me in this time period.
And so somehow I found the same thing years ago in a situation we had personally, where it was just having the words to it suddenly took away a lot of the grief that we were going through. And so one thing we talked about actually on the lead in was that when God's people do good works, Matthew 5:16, the world sees that and they praise the Lord. And we can go through history and find examples of that, starting back with the Parabolani in early Roman times. But whenever God's people step into that breach, has that been your experience? That there's an evangelistic aspect to it?
Yeah, absolutely. I can just say for myself, a number of our town leaders have said to us, thank you so much for what you guys are doing. And when they're saying that, they're applauding the collaborative effort that's taking place. And, if we're honest today, a lot of people have negative views about church. So all of a sudden, just to be a good partner in the community and to, honestly, we strive to follow all of the COVID rules the best we can and to do everything to the utmost ability so that we can be a witness of the Lord. And so from a macro point, I've seen it that. But Lucy, maybe you can speak to people who found our programs, right? There's been a lot of people who found our programs.
Yeah, particularly for Grief Share at the moment. And also it's looking into what can we do for mental health for this year. It's really guiding me at the moment in making choices as to how we meet needs. Haven't quite drawn to a full conclusion at the moment, but listening and seeing what is needed in the community. And unfortunately, divorce care is needed. And they seem to have an incredible way of each person that walks through divorce care comes to know the Lord at some point within that season. Grief Share is a very compassionate approach to allowing people to sharing, and that people find community. I think some of the smaller groups that we have, crews and just the house groups, that kind of thing, where you can just be in small groups and share with one another.
I do remember having some conversations closer to when this happened, families who were impacted with it, who were not believers, who were suddenly very open to a conversation because we're in the right place at the right time and loving them and caring for them. And so they were willing to listen to what we had. Adam, something I think a little bit off the beaten path when it comes to evangelism is the Newtown Theater Group that meets in the church. Can you just share with that story? It's kind of a cool story.
Yeah. There was coming out of the St. Diego tragedy, there was some local leaders who had it on their heart to create a theater program so that kids could go and find a place to use their gifts. And there was a lot of talk about resilience in terms of helping kids discover that they are able to get through this. And so the arts becomes a fantastic way to do that. And they began putting on Broadway quality kind of productions. And of course they found a partner in the Newtown schools, but there became a point where the Newtown school couldn't host them any longer. And so they needed a venue that could allow them to do these large productions. And so we were the closest thing to that nearby. And so they came to us and asked if we could allow them to use our building to have rehearsals and performances and really ongoing leadership classes. And so it was a hard decision because we're a busy church, but we said yes to that, and we made a room for that. And so it was an incredible thing to see thousands of people come through our doors to see these performances and really just champion and support something that was taking place from the community. But Charles, as you're pointing out, so many folks were so grateful for what the church did that they would start to attend services, and then they would hear about the hope found in Jesus. And we can point to many people who began a journey with Christ because of our just servant posture in that season.
I remember we caught some flack over that from church people who were not happy about the building being used for a secular purpose. But I remember some of the conversation we had was, you've got unsaved people willing to come into this church and bring other unsaved people into this church, and then start to have the conversations. I remember one time a friend of ours, Jim Anastasia, had some leftover sandwiches from, I guess, a men's ministry thing, and so wheeled them into them doing a practice and said, "Hey, you guys want any sandwiches?" And one of the conversations coming out of it is, what kind of church is this? Yeah. Because they weren't expecting receptivity and welcomeness from church people.
Definitely. It's funny. Another one we did, I don't know if you remember this, is that it's proven that animals are a real help to people during times of trauma, and comfort dogs and things of that nature. And we had an organization that wanted to have Mutts Gone Nuts, I think was the name of the program, come into the church. And literally this would be a dog clown show, basically, where the stage would be animals jumping around. And we had a hard decision to make, but we said yes to it. And to see the sanctuary, you heard me right, the sanctuary full of kids and families yelling and screaming as these dogs did these amazing things. And then as they pet the dogs afterwards, it was the Lord ministering in a very different way. So I would just say, sometimes you got to take a lot of risk, and sometimes you get it very wrong. Other times you get it and the Lord moves powerfully. But if we don't take risks, how are we ever going to know, right?
I've forgotten that incident, but I'm remembering it now that you say it. And I remember, I think my response was something along the lines of, okay. But your point on risks is really important. I remember a professor who would say, if you want to see God work, you're going to need to take risks on God, right? Because if you don't take risks on God, you don't need to see him work. But when you do, you see him work. And I think we've all had that kind of experience, at least at times in our lives. And I think we saw it here. I think there were a lot of risks that Walnut Hill took, and a lot of things that I think important to say, a lot of messy things, right? There's some of these conversations, some of these ministries, these are messy and problematic. And I think it's fair to say will come back to bite you at times, but you're still answering the call of God to serve and love people and disadvantage ourselves so that they can have the fullness of life God intends and that they find Jesus in that.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Any closing comments before we go?
I just had one, Charles. I was thinking about, as ministers and pastors and, folks who love Jesus, so often we love to just help. And I think something we saw after Sandy Hook relatively quickly was something they call compassion fatigue. And it's a very real thing because we just want to keep going. But we have to take care of ourselves. And I'll be the first to say I'm the worst at thinking of myself care first, and so I've learned some lessons from Sandy Hook, and I've gone up and down, and I'm re-putting them back into my life again. And something as simple as exercise is actually proven to be one of the most effective ways that your body can respond to trauma. And you might think that's not very spiritual, but it's what the Lord made us that way, right? And so reading your Bible, praying, exercising, all these kinds of things. I would just want to leave by saying that we learned a lot through that season, and those things are vital.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Adam, because I was going to say it's actually the same thing, self-care. And I think that's where the collaboration that you mentioned was so important, because not one person or one organization can do it. You'll burn out and you're not productive for anybody. So self-care is so important. And I think as Christians, and anybody in the sort of clinical care world is not great at doing that, but so important. Actually, make sure you have a couple of hours of retreat time as much as needed, and just go and spend time in worship. Worship just, it does something to the soul and the spirit. But the self-care is so important.
That's great points. Thank you very much. And so Lucy, Adam, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for your faithful service to the kingdom. Thank you for your friendship and the impact that Walnut Hill and you all have had on our family. I'm grateful to you on a personal level for that. But thanks for helping us understand trauma a bit more and where the church can play a role in it and what our calling is in it, and how God uses it, and letting us benefit and learn from the pain and the suffering and the learnings that you all had to go through. So thanks very much for being with us. I'd also like to thank our producer, Bob Atherton, for making all this happen behind the scenes. And I'd like to thank our listeners. If you're thinking you might be called and convicted on this topic and want to engage, let us know. We'd love to pray for you as you consider next steps, or help connect you to some of the resources that Adam and Lucy talked about, or other resources. And maybe just one last thing in the Boston area, if you're hit by this topic, is the Corey Johnson program, which is doing a lot of work locally dealing with trauma before COVID, but now, of course, they're probably dealing with some of the same things we talked about. And so thank you again. And our next podcast is January 14th, and we'll see you then.